Good afternoon. I am Nate Anderson. I'm the Executive Director of Concerned Veterans for America, and I want to welcome you all to our policy forum featuring Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky. And of course, I want to wish everybody well. I hope that you and your families are safe, that you're healthy right now. And of course, we're very, very happy to have you all with us, joining online, streaming on Facebook this afternoon. The mission of Concerned Veterans for America is to advocate for policies that preserve the freedom and the prosperity that we and our families have sacrificed to defend. And policy is going to be the focus of our conversation here today, specifically U.S. foreign policy. And we are very fortunate to have Senator Rand Paul with us to talk through some of these very, very important issues for our nation. I'm very excited for this discussion, and I hope that it's valuable to all of you tuning in. So let me introduce our special guest this afternoon. Senator Rand Paul grew up in Lake Jackson, Texas, and attended Baylor University. He graduated from Duke Medical School in 1988. In addition to his responsibilities as a lawmaker, Dr. Paul is a dedicated physician and owned his own ophthalmology practice in Kentucky. Dr. Paul was elected to the United States Senate in 2010, and he's been an outspoken champion for constitutional liberties and fiscal responsibility. And he's a very fierce advocate against government overreach. And Senator Paul resides in Bowling Green, Kentucky. Senator, on behalf of Concerned Veterans for America, welcome. Thanks for giving us your time. I know you're very busy. It's an honor to have you with us.
Thank you, Nate. Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to it, and let's jump right in.
You bet. But before we get into some of these policy questions, I just wanted to ask how you and your staff, your constituents are doing during this time.
You know, I think pretty good. I mean, if you're talking about in reference to the coronavirus and the pandemic, you know, Kentucky's a more rural state, so we haven't been hit nearly as much as some of the states with bigger populations. I think there's still an unknown as far as whether or not the bigger states will have had enough infection that they may well be done with this and the infections may slide lower, and whether rural communities will have to have enough infection ultimately for the infection to leave us. We may well know the natural course of this disease before we're over, or we may get a vaccine and be able to alter it. I've not been a big believer that human behavior is changing the course of this for the most part. I think when a community gets a significant amount of infection, I think the infection slows down. And we're seeing some of that, I think, in New York and Sweden, Northern Italy, various other parts around the world. But Kentucky, we're pretty rural and have not seen that significant surge yet. So I think what's unknown is whether or not we'll have a long course of this or whether the vaccine will come in time, but I think we're all going to find out pretty soon. But fortunately, Kentucky's been relatively spared compared to other states.
Good. That's very good to hear. Well, jumping into our conversation, I want to start with a question about the AUMF. Since its adoption just 19 years ago, as of last week, the 2001 authorization for use of military force has been invoked many, many times to justify force far beyond its original intended scope. And you sponsored a previous NDAA amendment that would limit this trend by ensuring that a new authorization would be required to initiate force in a future conflict. So my question is, should a new authorization be required in that kind of a situation, and how should it be constructed to limit its potential for being misused beyond what it's intended to do?
Well, I think it's important for your audience to understand that our founding fathers were very, very clear that they didn't want the ability to declare war or initiate war to be with the executive. There had been a long history of kings and queens, brothers, cousins, fighting basically perpetual war in Europe. And so when our founding fathers came together, they said, enough's enough. We're not going to let the executive or the president have that power. Madison put it this way. Madison said that the executive branch is the branch most prone to war. Therefore, the Constitution, with studied care, vested that power in the legislature. And there wasn't any disagreement. Washington, Hamilton, Jefferson, Madison, all the different personalities believed that war should be in the legislature. And it has been for most of our history. We unfortunately don't declare war anymore. They sort of have this other wording for it, as you referred to, AUMF, or authorizing the use of military force. but at least it is passed by the Congress, and it is somewhat akin to a declaration of war. When we were attacked on 9/11, George W. Bush did the right thing. He came to Congress and said, I want a declaration of war, or I want an AUMF to go after those who either committed the attack or aided or abetted those. And so in 2001, we voted on that. It was a very narrow proposition, and we went to war. I actually would have supported that. You know, we were attacked on 9/11 in a vile way, and I think responding was absolutely appropriate. But you're right, since then, that use of force against people who attacked us on 9/11, I think has been used, we counted it up, 41 times in 19 different countries. And so it's used as a worldwide proclamation of war, but it wasn't intended to be so. You'll hear people often say, well, those are associated forces that are associated with the people who attacked us on 9/11. They act as if associated forces is in the 9/11 AUMF, but it's not. Associated forces was an interpretation of the Bush administration that just came to be a way to stretch it to cover other things. The problem is we're now 20 years in. There's no one alive that had anything to do with 9/11. There's no one alive who aided or abetted anybody to do with 9/11. And some goat herder in Mali has nothing to do with 9/11. But we're now using this authorization that was voted on a generation ago by most of the people gone from Congress, many of them, you know, long gone from Congress. And my point is that one generation should not bind another generation. So if we're to be at war in Mali or Somalia, God forbid, and I'm still waiting for someone to explain to me who's fighting in Somalia and what we would be fighting for, and who the Thomas Jefferson of Somalia or Libya or Mali is. It's very unclear to me. And I'm just not big on sending my kids, your kids. You know, I have 3 nephews who have served in the military recently, brother-in-law from the Air Force Academy, father-in-law was career. My dad was in for 5 years. So I see this very personally, as if we're, you know, I don't see it as a geopolitical chess game. I see it as I'm sending one of my friends, one of my good friends in Bowling Green. His son is just newly commissioned lieutenant, first lieutenant in the Army. And I see this as something very personal and important, but we should have to vote. If people want to be at war in Syria, they want to be at war in Iraq, they want to be at war in any of these places, we should vote, because voting is difficult, because you're putting your name on the line and you are saying, I think we should go to war. And we don't do that. So it's really incredibly unconstitutional, but also unfair to our troops not to declare what the mission is. And I defy any general to come on this program or any other program and say, what is the mission in Afghanistan and what does it have to do with 9/11? They'll have a tough time answering it because it's really morphed into a nation building sort of enterprise.
Indeed. And you've said that there's no debate more significant for a legislator than to decide to engage in war. And you've been very vocal about that need for Congress to reassert its constitutional role. And as a veteran, I appreciate that. I know that a lot of others do also. So thank you for that. I just want to, yes, sir.
I was just going to say, I think it's amazing when you talk to veterans. People think veterans are going to be monolithically for war. Well, they have to fight the war. And I think they take it very seriously. We also have a professional Army now. And so they're not just 18-year-old, 19-year-old kids with no family. They're often 35, 40, 45 with families and wives at home. And they're thoughtful people. They think and read about policy. They don't always get asked their opinion. But, you know, their 8th or 9th tour in Afghanistan, when they've had, you know, buddies who were blown up or whatever, they start thinking, well, gosh, shouldn't they vote on this in Congress? Shouldn't they express why I'm putting my life on the line? So I think many military and ex-military guys and women are actually with us on this. And when you look at polling data, and I think your organization's done some of this polling data, you actually see that, well over half of veterans actually do think that we need to make a decision on whether or not we should still be in Afghanistan at the very least.
Absolutely. It is a very personal thing. And on the note of Afghanistan, you've been a very vocal advocate about bringing our troops home from that country. And one of the potential hurdles that we're seeing now from leaving Afghanistan is language that was added to the House version of the National Defense Authorization Act that would actually limit the president's ability to withdraw troops unless some very, very broad requirements are met. Should lawmakers involved in the conference for the NDAA remove that language? And why might that be good for the president's plan to bring our troops home from Afghanistan?
You know, without question, it should be removed. This is Liz Cheney's language, I believe. And the thing that's interesting is they don't want to have the legislature decide when we go to war, but now they want the legislature to decide that we should stay at war. And they want to take the power away from the president to declare an end to the war. And I think while the legislature should vote on initiating war, the actual conduct of the war and how a war comes to a conclusion has to be done, you know, in consultation with how you either win or come to a stalemate in a war. And the president really, I think, is someone who needs to make that decision. Now, Congress can help to end a war by not funding it, but I've never heard of Congress saying, oh no, we want perpetual war, we're going to perpetually fund this. That's another big question, is where does that money come from? You know, costs about $50 billion for the war in Afghanistan. It adds up to over trillions of dollars that we've spent on this. And it's the big question I always ask people, and that is whether or not there are unintended consequences. So, I mean, you know, George W. Bush, I sat down and talked with him for an hour and a half one time after he was out of the presidency, and I asked him, I said, had 9/11 not happened, do you think your foreign policy would have been closer to your father's, a little more of a realist or realism foreign policy? And he said, absolutely not. I've always believed in spreading freedom and democracy everywhere. And I want to make, you know, it's our job as America to take the fight everywhere around the world to free the world. And it's an unrealistic sort of notion, but it's also a bankrupting notion. And it's a notion that involves a lot of nation building and other functions that many in the military think are not really the job of our soldiers. So it is disappointing to see that, but it is important that we have these debates, and that should be stripped from the NDAA, absolutely. You know, trying to prevent our leaving, we had the same sort of battle, not binding language, but right after the president chose not to get further involved in the pending war between Syria and Turkey over that border, the Senate leader on our side introduced a resolution saying it would be precipitous to leave, you know, Afghanistan or the Middle East after 19 years. And it's like, really? 19 years and it would be precipitous? So no, I think the people are ready. Every day I have the discussions about people who want to do some things in our country where there's not enough money to do them, building roads, repairing things that have to be taken care of in our country. There's not enough money because we're building roads in Afghanistan, frankly. And then if you look at how the roads are built, half the time some contractor's stealing half the money and running off to Jordan or somewhere else in the Middle East with half the money. And there's case after case of that kind of abusive waste in Afghanistan.
Indeed. And it is very concerning, this move from the House. There's a very concerning irony at play, given that Congress hasn't voted on the Afghanistan conflict since 2001. It's very unfortunate to see. For those of you just joining, I'm Nate Anderson. I'm the Executive Director of Concerned Veterans for America. And with me here is Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky. And we are just a few minutes away from taking some of your questions. So if you've got a question, drop those in the chat. And some of our staff are looking for those, and we're going to get an opportunity to ask the Senator in just a few minutes. Senator, in recent years, the NATO alliance has steadily grown eastward across Europe. And some now argue for expanding NATO even further to countries like Georgia, Ukraine, which border Russia. How do you believe NATO expansion might impact U.S. national security as well as our diplomatic efforts abroad?
You know, I think there's a possibility of it being counterproductive or, you know, being a tripwire that draws us into war. The alliance initially was to have the large, long-standing free democracies be together to combat sort of like a 3 million person Soviet army that was sort of in Eastern Europe and threatening Europe. And so there was a reason in the beginning, but now it's become the debate over like putting Montenegro in. And so I oppose, you know, the tiny little country of Montenegro. There are baseball players that have bigger salaries than the defense budget of Montenegro, you know? So, I mean, it's just kind of ridiculous to think that they add to our defense somehow. but it could involve us in another Balkan war, another war with Serbia, et cetera. But don't think it adds anything to our defense. Then there's the question of whether or not we add these countries on Russia's border. So, if you add Georgia, the country of Georgia to NATO, the question is, does it provoke or not provoke Russia? And some would say, oh, it prevents war. I think it guarantees war. Georgia is currently divided and has been divided probably for 10 years with Russians occupying part of Georgia. But unless you're willing to send, 500,000 troops over there to push Russia out of Georgia and fight a battle 3,000 miles away from our border to do that, I think it would be a big mistake to put them in NATO. It's also one of the beefs I had with McCain. And McCain was a war hero, but also sort of a mean-spirited person and very unfair. And when I opposed Montenegro for philosophical reasons being in NATO, he went to the Senate floor and said, well, I see the senator from Kentucky is now working for Putin. And it's like, you son of a bitch, you just called me a traitor to my country because I oppose having a certain small little country be part of NATO. You can disagree with me, but it was a disgusting sort of thing for him to do on the Senate floor. And, people wonder why there are mixed feelings about him. Well, going to the floor and calling someone a traitor because they don't want to expand NATO is sort of a very mean-spirited thing that, I think people ought to know it's part of his legacy.
I think that there's also, it's clear that some of these European nations also have a hard enough time providing for their own defense, much less contributing in a substantial way to NATO. And that also leads to some very unequal sharing of the burden, if you will. And unfortunately, it's going to be American taxpayers who have to pick up that bill.
And it always seems to be. It always seems to be. And this is something I've liked about President Trump is he's browbeat the hell out of them in NATO. And some of them actually have increased their spending, to closer to the 2% level that they've kind of agreed to. But I think the president's very aware of that we pick up the bill for everything. Look, the WHO may in the early days not have told the complete truth about the origins of the virus in China. I don't know. But it sounds like there was a lot of dialogue between the Communist Party in China and the head of the WHO. But who pays the bill for the WHO? It's always us, United Nations. Look, I'm for dialogue and I'm for, having an international assembly, but it shouldn't be always us that has to pick up the tab. We always have to pay a disproportionate amount of everything. And frankly, we just don't have it. We run about $1 trillion deficit every year. And so I'm not against international institutions or even NATO necessarily, but we shouldn't always have to be Uncle Sam sugar daddy that pays for everything.
Indeed. Well, Senator, let's go to some audience questions. We've got one question here from another Nate. Nate says, what is preventing your colleagues in both the House and the Senate from listening to the overwhelming support from their constituents who are calling for an end to the war in Afghanistan and the Middle East as a whole? What's standing in the way?
I think it's an example of how there's a disconnect between the populace and the elected people. So if you polled Kentucky and you asked the voters of Kentucky, do you think we've achieved our purpose in Afghanistan? Could we end the war and come home in an organized fashion? It'd probably poll at 65, 70%. But then if you polled the Senate on that, when that resolution came up that I talked about where they said, oh, we shouldn't leave precipitously, it was 77 voting to stay in Afghanistan and only 23 of us voting to come home. The mixture has been only a few Republicans, Mike Lee and I, and probably about 21 Democrats were on that resolution. But I don't think they're reflecting the people because whether it's a Republican or a Democrat state, the polls are pretty consistent that well over half the people think that we've achieved our purpose in Afghanistan. It's time to come home. But somehow you have this disconnect. And if there's anything in Washington that there's too much bipartisanship on, it's actually foreign policy. There's a lot of bipartisan consensus that we should be everywhere all of the time. So the interesting thing is you'll find that the Democrats and Republicans that run most of the committees on either foreign policy or on armed services are actually very, very much interventionists. They are people who believe that it's always our responsibility to both pay for the world and to fight all of the wars of the world to figure out, what is best. But I keep pointing out, and I think it's important, and I think President Trump's the first person to get this, is that there are unintended consequences. And he said it in his long speeches. I've said it for years. My dad said it for years. When you get rid of a dictator like Saddam Hussein, it's easy to make the argument that he abuses women's rights, he abused the Kurds' rights, he abused human rights. He didn't believe in any rights. He was a dictator. And yet, when you remove him, you didn't get freedom and you didn't get democracy. You got maybe a hint of democracy. But what you ended up getting really was, for a long time, a power vacuum with a very weak government. ISIS was able to form because there was no Saddam Hussein. ISIS was also able to form because Bashar Assad was weakened also by civil war. So terrorists form in the middle of weakness. But here's the other irony. Who is Iraq's greatest ally in the world now? Iran. So many of the people who wanted to get rid of Saddam Hussein are also the people who say, oh, well, we fear Iran being so strong and Iran strong. It's like, well, guess what? Iran is stronger because you got rid of Saddam Hussein. There was somewhat of a balance of power in the Middle East. Wasn't perfect, but it was somewhat balanced. Same thing in Libya. You know, we bombed Gaddafi into, running off, and then they were able to get rid of Gaddafi on their own after we bombed him. But the thing is what came out of Libya was chaos, more terrorism. So we call it this war on terrorism, but it turns out there may be more terrorism when we get rid of their government, because you get chaos, and that's where terrorism thrives. Same in Syria. Assad, once again, another dictator, doesn't believe in human rights, barrel bombs his people. He isn't a great guy. Everybody can agree to that. But had we done nothing in 2011, he probably have killed 5,000 or 10,000 of his people and he'd still be dictator. We went in and we helped. So did Qatar, so did Saudi Arabia. We poured weapons in there, thousands of tons of weapons, and we did weaken Assad. And as we weakened Assad, in the middle of that civil war that went on and on and on and still goes on, 500,000 people died and 5 million people were displaced. So the practical nature of it is the neoconservatives who promote these wars they're well-intended. They want peace and democracy like George Bush wanted everywhere. But in the end result isn't peace and democracy. The end result is mass killing, carnage, weakened government. ISIS arose in the midst of a weakened government in Iraq and a weakened government in Syria. So people have to look at the unintended consequences. And actually, I think Trump gets this. Trump got that Saddam Hussein was a terrible guy, but it actually became worse when he was gone.
I like how you frame it up in that way, unintended consequences. That's very true. That was a great question by Nate. Thank you, Nate. We've got another question from Juliana, and this one is about veterans, it looks like. CVA has long been an advocate for giving veterans more choice as to where they receive their health care. And the VA Mission Act was signed into law 2 years ago and significantly expanded healthcare options for veterans. How does this impact our nation's veterans?
You know, I'm a physician and I've worked in a bunch of veterans hospitals. I worked in one in Durham, North Carolina, Fayetteville, North Carolina, Asheville, North Carolina, Louisville, Kentucky. So I know how the VA system works. In general, I think the quality of the doctors is actually pretty good. The quality of the medicine is pretty good. But because it's run by the government, it's incredibly inefficient. So you wait hours and hours and hours. And I remember as a medical student getting my one patient I needed to work up that day, and he'd get up to the floor at 10 o'clock. He's exhausted. I'm exhausted. I said, well, when did you get here? Oh, I've been here since noon, So the system's not very good. And so building more VA hospitals isn't the answer. But people say, oh, you're going to get rid of the VA hospitals. I'm not for that either. I'm sort of for having the VA hospitals that we have specialize in veterans' injuries and needs. So acute injuries that you need for veterans, dealing with, unfortunately, amputations, dealing with burns, dealing with gunshot wounds, and PTSD, and some things that are very much veterans need to have dealt with. But then when the veteran, if they still have health care that they're obligated, the military is obligated to give them, and they're 50, they don't necessarily need a VA so much for a colonoscopy. And in fact, it actually is probably cheaper to give them a form of insurance, which is what choice is, to go to a local doctor in their town, not drive an hour away, not sit for hours and get their colonoscopy done. It's also cheaper than building a hospital everywhere, a VA hospital, which have notoriously run into cost overruns. If you remember, there was one in Aurora, Colorado that cost, I forget what it cost, $1 billion or something. It's just something crazy, like $10 million per hospital room or something. And so the government's just not very good at spending money like that, but we've obligated and said we're going to take care of the veterans. So I think it's more economic, better for the veterans. They have to drive less far, to have specialized veterans hospitals that help them. And if you live near one, you'd still be able to go to one. But if you live an hour away, you don't have to drive an hour, wait 2 hours, wait 5 hours, and then drive 2 hours back. So I think the veterans, once it works, will like the choice program. When they first did it, it was imperfect because they would say, oh, you have a VA clinic in your town. Well, if the VA clinic was a family doctor and not a urologist, you still were having to drive in an hour and a half. But we fixed some of those problems where people are now able to see a local urologist, even if there is a VA clinic, because the VA clinic didn't have a urologist. And so we fixed some of the hurdles to it, and we have put a lot of money in it, and it's going to get more expensive over time because we've been at war forever. You know, we have so many veterans, so we do need to account for it. And if we've obligated ourselves to this, we need to take care of them. But doesn't mean that we do it without any kind of concern for cost. We have to kind of do it in a way in which we can still afford it.
I can attest personally. I've used VA care. I've also used the community care through the VA, and it's personally saved me a tremendous amount of time and frustration to be able to use that program as a veteran. And if any veterans out there are curious about that,
do you think it's working better?
Absolutely. It's been a huge step forward, personally, my ability to get some of the care that I needed as a vet. And I would encourage veterans to look into it and talk to their primary care provider if that's something that they want to learn about. I'm glad Julianne asked that question. I have one more question here from Dan. And I think, Senator, you mentioned earlier in our conversation about our national debt. And this question seems to be about that. Dan says, in part due to the burdens of responding to COVID-19, our country now faces a massive debt. And Admiral Mike Mullen warned in 2010 that our greatest national security threat was our debt. Given the role of DoD spending in increasing debt, do you think that defense spending levels should be reevaluated? And are there any specific areas where you think that could be achieved?
I think we need to, put it in perspective, how much we spend versus other countries. And so one of the statistics that illustrates how much we spend is that our military budget spends more than about the next 10 countries combined. And it drops off quite a bit. So we spend about, $750 billion in a year now. The second biggest spender is, I believe, China. They might be 150 billion. The third biggest, interestingly, and a lot of people don't realize this, is now Saudi Arabia, spends about 80 some odd billion. And then it drops off from there. I think it's important to know, one, how much we're spending, because I think we could conserve costs on it. But I think it's another thing to also, when we are looking at the threats around the world, there are many people that paint Iran as this opponent that, oh my goodness, if we look the other way, Iran's going to conquer the world. One reason I think that's probably not true, and I'm not saying, they're great people or great government. I mean, I think they've got a terrible, tyrannical government like a lot of others in the Middle East. But what I would say is we need to put in perspective how much they spend. They spend about 17 billion a year. And in fact, if you compare the Arab nations, Saudi Arabia and the 14 Gulf nations around it, they spend 8 times more than Iran. So when we look for checks and balances and we say, and that's not including Israel, so we look for checks and balances and we say, well, could the Middle East, we can still be allied to them, we could help them, but is it really got to be our primary influence that we have to do something about Iran? And I'm not saying do nothing, but what I am saying is look at the balance of power. Saudi Arabia spending 83 billion, Iran spending 17 billion, but Saudi Arabia also has many Arab allies there. Iran has very few. So I think we do need to look at what we're spending our money on. A lot of it's their perpetual war. Basically, being in Afghanistan forever costs us a lot of money. At least 50 billion a year is spent just in Afghanistan. But there's a lot of money too in Iraq. Iraq now doesn't want us there. Their legislature has said that it's time for us to come home. And there's a large expenditure still in Iraq as well for military bases, as well as an enormous embassy that we have there. So yes, I do think we need to reassess what we're spending. It is the primary function of the federal government to defend the country, so we have to have an adequate defense. But doesn't mean we just always want more of everything. Because Apache helicopters are good, and we have, I don't know, let's say we have 1,000, does that mean we need 10,000? Because nuclear weapons are good or help to defend us against this threat from other countries with nuclear weapons. Because we have, I'm just making up the number, but if we have 1,000, does that mean we need 10,000? You know, so there needs to be some discussion of how much is enough with regard to nuclear weapons, you know, attack airplanes, aircraft carriers, et cetera. And I think there is an argument to be made that we could spend less than we currently do.
We have limited resources, indeed, and we need to be smart about the way that we use those resources, including taxpayer dollars. This has been terrific, Senator. As we wrap up, I know you're very busy. I just wanted to give you a chance to say any final thoughts or words that you have to our audience on these important foreign policy issues that we've been discussing, and that you've been an outspoken voice on.
Well, I want to thank you for having me on, and also for the work you guys do, because I think veterans need a place to go for a group that has a realistic outlook towards what veterans want. And that I think a lot of times people really mistake that every veteran or every active duty soldier wants to have another tour in Afghanistan. I think they haven't talked to many veterans if they believe that. Soldiers will go. They signed up to volunteer, and they will do what they're told. That's their job, and they will go to Afghanistan and still do, and they still go over to the Middle East. But I think if you talk to many who've been on several tours, they want to know what we're fighting for, and they want Congress to vote on it. And it really is an obligation. You know, I don't blame any of our soldiers for any of the problems we have. I blame our politicians. Our politicians need to have these debates. It absolutely is owed to our soldiers to have a debate over when we go to war. And you can't just vote once in 2001 and say, oh, that's enough to go to war everywhere for the rest of time. And people who argue that, we need to send them back home. There are a lot of politicians up here who say enough's enough. We don't need to vote ever again. The 2001 authorization means we can be at war anywhere, anytime, against any enemy. And Mali is not Somalia, it is not Afghanistan, it is not Iraq, it is not Iran. It is not carte blanche. Each one is different and need to be debated. And really, people need to look at the messes we're involved. We are hugely still involved in Somalia. And, you know, figuring out who the good guys are, and, you know, you got probably 10 different clans all fighting each other, have always been fighting each other. And figuring out, the way I look at it is it enough for me to send my good friend's son over there, or my son or my nephew to fight some warlord in Somalia? And I frankly think no. I just don't think it's something we ought to be involved in. And if they decide to come out and attack our ships, their pirates do, we should punish them and not let it happen. But above that, are we going to go in and figure out who the good guys are in Somalia or Mali? I think we have language barriers, cultural barriers, and frankly, you know, we just sometimes don't know who the good guys are, and we sometimes pick the wrong so-called good guy, and it winds up worse. So, but I appreciate the work you guys do, and I thank you for having me on.
Thank you, Senator, for your time, and as well as your staff. Your staff's been terrific in supporting this. I also want to thank the Concerned Veterans for America staff who made this possible. A lot of work went into this. And of course, our audience out there watching, tuning in, thank you very much for joining us. I hope this was valuable. I hope that you'll stay connected to us. You can learn more about Concerned Veterans for America by going to our website. That website is cv4a.org, cv4a.org. And we are on Twitter at Concerned Vets, and Facebook, Concerned Vets for America. So go and check us out, follow us, retweet, share our content, and engage with us. And a step further, if you agree with what you heard in this conversation and you want to do something about it, you can. And that's why we exist. We're a platform for individuals like those of you tuning in who want to make a difference. And the first thing you could do, I encourage you to share this video on your social networks, and that really helps us elevate these discussions, and it allows more people to hear a fresh perspective that they might not hear otherwise. I also want to invite you to visit a special campaign website that we have at Concerned Veterans for America. It's called End Endless Wars. You can just go to endendlesswars.com, and with a very easy click of a button, you can send a letter to your representative as well as your two senators and the President of the United States, that asks our leaders in Washington to bring an end to this conflict in Afghanistan and bring our troops home to their families after 19 years in that conflict. Again, that's endlesswars.com. Go and check it out. I encourage you to share that as well. Again, thank you for joining us. Stay safe out there and be well. Thank you, everyone.